You're in the water loop.
Welcome to Waterloop, the nonprofit news outlet exploring solutions for sustainability and equity in water. I'm the host, Travis Loop. Houston is known as the energy capital, but it's also the Bayou City, where water flows through culture, memory, justice, and resilience. In this episode from the Color of Water series, Ayanna Jolivet Mccloud, Executive Director of Bayou City Waterkeeper, discusses the group's efforts to protect wetlands, hold polluters accountable, and connect communities with their watersheds. Ayanna, we're very happy to have you here on as part of our Color of Water series. You're one of the amazing members of the directory that Jose and the Water Hub runs. I had the great fortune of meeting up with you in person in Houston recently and seeing some of your work down there. Excited for a full conversation here. Could you share first your journey that led you to water and environment and justice? How did you get to this moment leading Bayou City Waterkeeper?
Yeah, great to be here. Thanks for having me, Travis and Jose. I feel like my pathway has done a lot of it. It sort of reflects the sort of natural sort of movement of water. It has been a lot of sort of swiggling and turning. I don't have a straight point of entry into this work. And I actually think that this is the strength of who I am and what I bring. And this was a big challenge in me showing up in leadership in this organization initially, and that you see a lot of folks that are doing this work, especially like in waterkeepers or water policy. You know, many folks have science backgrounds or law backgrounds or policy makers. I'm really proud to bring a sort of a layered more approach to this work. I worked in nonprofit administration, nonprofit leadership with a focus on community equity, culture, and mostly arts and cultural organizations for the earlier part of my career for like 15 plus years. Concurrently, I'm an artist. I'm a fourth generation artist. And so I've always, yes. And so I've made art, had a parallel career making art while I was also working in the arts. My art has always been about the environment. I think that was my initial point of entry. And that I've always been inspired and made art that was inspired by different sites, that wherever I'm living at, I would just sort of look at work and make installation and sculpture work that is really trying to sort of do some recalling of what is it that we don't see in the space. Usually we see environment and we see nature as this sort of neutral place. But for a lot of communities, especially communities of color, so much of our histories have been removed, have been silenced, are not included in what we see. So many of our natural scapes are actually lost and actually destroyed too. And so how can I recall, if I'm in a place, how can I just activate that space, go to the space and recall these histories? So that was what the art was about. And I think that is one important point of entry of how I arrived in this work. I think the other piece is I was working in the arts for a while and I pivoted. I said, this is not enough to like work sort of professionally right after I think actually during the peak time of COVID and also racial reckoning, I was called to do more work in this moment. And so I decided to move into working directly in the environments. One other thing that I'll share is, you know, I've sort of kind of quieted this part of my own lived experience, but I forget how important that lived experience is in this work. Growing up in Houston, being from Houston, water is so much a part of who I am. And it was always sort of in the background. And just not only water, but just the habitats that supported. And so it's a very beautiful sort of lush environment. And I think that coming from a water city, being surrounded by water, experiencing the impacts of water, like experiencing flooding, losing a home, 2 major flood event. I just have those vivid memories of water being up to my parents' waist and us sort of wading through that water. So water has been connected to me in this very lived way. It's been always proximate to me, but the environment and the environment as it relates to diverse communities is also something that is a current in my sort of trajectory in this work.
That's amazing. Such a
interesting, inspiring pathway or trajectory, including the art and, of course, your activism and then your personal connection. For those that are not familiar, can you share a little bit about Bayou City Waterkeepers, its mission, and the role it plays in protecting Houston's waterways?
So our mission is to protect the waters and the peoples of the Houston region through bold legal action, community science, creative grassroots policy to further justice, health, and safety for our region. One thing that I'll share is our values, because our values really reflect kind of how we work. Values are bold action, fluidity, interconnectivity, justice, and equity and regeneration. I'm going to say a sentence that has a lot of clunky kind of words, but this is so essential in this work. We work in a highly collaborative, cross-disciplinary, intersectional way as a connector. That is intentional, and it's also a challenge. And so we realized to serve a region as big as our watershed, Houston is huge. Greater Houston is huge, and so the way that we work has to be innovative. We have alliances and we work very closely in collaboration with conservation organizations and also environmental justice organizations. And I'll say that two things that you'll see woven in our work is the importance of nature-based solutions and the importance of equity and justice. Examples of our work is we leverage litigation and enforcement like other waterkeeper models too. And so leveraging the law, such as the Clean Water Act, we leverage data science, organizing, and policy. And then cultural strategies is woven into that work. We are sort of part of that waterkeeper model. And so those are the roots of our work, even though we're an independent organization. In terms of that bold action value, we're not afraid to push back, hold decision makers accountable, hold government, industrial polluters accountable, do all these tools to make sure that we're fighting for our waterways and our community. One of the things I'm really proud of, especially in recent years, is how we have really rooted the work in community. It's all in service to community and also to our environment, to our habitat, and to our waterways. So, and I can share some more concrete examples of what that looks like in action in a bit too.
Mentioned at the beginning that I had the chance to get down there to Houston recently as part of some filming I was doing, but meet up with you. A couple things. I hadn't spent a lot of time in Houston, and the size of the area, you're right, it is immense just to get from one place to the other. Huge region. I guess it is Texas. But then, Bayou City, I never knew that nickname. I've heard bayous in Louisiana, but hadn't really heard that over in Texas. But, I learned about bayous that kind of crisscross that area, and thus the name. But then the place where we got to meet up was you had me meet you at Sims Bayou and kind of learn a little bit about that place and how it reflects and connects to your work. So could you just kind of share about Sims Bayou, and again, how it connects to what you're doing with Waterkeeper and connects to, I think, a lot of the things you talked about, your lived experience, the communities that need it, all.
Yeah, Houston is huge. Yes, I agree with you. And I'm glad. And that's the other piece is that, a lot of people don't know that our namesake is the Bayou City. I think that a lot of local people actually forget that we are the Bayou City. And so part of my work and my vision is to remind ourselves to reclaim being a water city. We're known as the energy capital. We have many petrochemical facilities here. And what does it mean to reclaim being a water city? And so in doing that, what does that mean to see the bayous that are crisscrossing our watershed? I'll talk about Sims Bayou. I do want to just say this too. In terms of sort of narrative change, I think that's a really important piece of how I do our work. For me, I believe that we have to constantly be rethinking the frameworks in which we do this work, and maybe the tools that we've been given or the policies that we've been given, the language we've been given, maybe those need to be sort of rethought on so many different levels. And so language-wise, I like to just hone in on that. And I think about Bayou City. We are water. And also one thing that I remind people of is we think sort of terrestrially, we think in terms of land, but we forget water. Water makes up most of the earth. So how can we shift our language to reclaim water words, to think about waterscapes, not just landscapes too. So I just wanted to say that in terms of our namesake, I'm so about reclaiming Houston as a water city, and I think there's so much that we can learn from Houston. I think in terms of that particular bayou, that is a bayou that I'm really connected with personally. I actually grew up near that bayou. The reason that I'm really fond of that bayou is that it traverses many parts of our watershed and beyond our watershed. It touches on a lot of working class and communities of color. And I think that there's a hierarchy of sort of green spaces that we don't always name. The way you see that hierarchy is the way is how you look at investment. What do we choose to what do our decision makers choose to invest in our watershed? How are watersheds, different waterways, some, protected more than others. But this one is one that it has a history of, touching in all these different communities. And I feel like it's kind of one of those forgotten waterways. And I really am a champion of the underdog, as you can see. It also has a beautiful advocacy history. And I love that. A good advocacy history in that it was going to be channelized by it was already channelized decades ago, but like it was going to be concrete lined and widened even and straightened even more in the 90s. And it's an example of how we can advocate for our waterways. It was a combination of a landscape architect and community group that all got together to advocate for this waterway and also just do some sort of co-learning, community learning. I remember learning that, the landscape architect learned about fluviomorphology and learned how do waterways sort of naturally run. And rivers naturally meander. And so it's an example of what advocacy can look like and how important those histories are to protect our waterways, especially in these communities. And one final thing that you saw, you got like a little snippet of when you visited, is that they're building a hill there. It's called the Hill at Sims too. And so it's just an example for the connection to Bayou City Waterkeeper is that we advocate for green infrastructure. I mean, the sort of seeds of this work is through our wetland protection. We've historically advocated for wetland protection. But in recent years, we've also advocated for the interconnectivity of not only advocate for wetlands upstream, but flood mitigation downstream. And what do communities downstream, how are they impacted? What do they need? And how can they also get green infrastructure in those communities? And I think this is a good example of a project alongside a waterway that serves that community, that does the kind of ecosystem services work. And it also is a sort of beautification and sort of recreational project too.
You already touched on this, but can you just expand a little more on what's the intersection between protecting these values and doing, wetland restoration, and protecting communities that have been marginalized? What's the connection between those two efforts?
I think we're seeing more and more connectivity and more sort of collaboration, but you do still see a distinction between conservation organizations and then environmental justice organizations. And I think that more conservation organizations could do environmental justice or even center communities more equitably in a better way. Or they can just sort of lean into environmental justice and those principles and action. What I've seen also is more environmental justice organizations or water justice organizations are wanting to see more nature-based solutions in their communities. So Bayou City Waterkeeper is a great example of how we can do both. It doesn't have to be one or the other. And how do we think about a more nuanced approach to environmental justice and conservation? How do we see green infrastructure and we see pollution in our communities, industrial risk, the history of inequitable sort of water infrastructure and how that's impacting communities as well. How do we talk about the habitats that are being affected, the ecosystems that are being affected, and talk about the communities that are being impacted? We can do both. And for us, our sort of framework around water justice, when we say water justice, our understanding is that it is all of those things. It's not just people. It is, what does justice look like for our habitat, for our waterways and communities? And then what does that also look like for people too? And so it's always the and, not the or, not the but the and this more integrated approach. And being inspired by water, the very way that water works is it's interconnected. So you can't isolate water. What happens upstream affects downstream. So when we have the loss of wetlands, the destruction of wetlands, then we have the flooding impacts of both water quantity and water quality. So we have to name the interconnectivity of ecosystems, but especially water, to really rethink our frameworks of doing this work in terms of like justice.
I'm curious for maybe some other examples of impact that you'd like to share, things you've been involved with, Bayou City Waterkeeper's been involved with during, I guess, your relatively short but powerful tenure with the organization here. Yeah, what else would you like to shine a light on?
We've really fought to protect our wetlands, and we've taken that by basically, leveraging the Clean Water Act. Whenever we see developers unlawfully building in wetlands, and sometimes that results in litigation, sometimes that does, to mitigate the loss of that wetland or different, there's other measures too. We've done that for 20 plus years, but we built on that and we realized that that's not enough. And so using data science to map, what we're realizing is that we're losing so many wetlands in Houston at a sort of a very fast pace because of all the development, all of the growth and the lack of regulation and lack of enforcement too. And so what we did is we mapped what are the 5 critical wetlands that we can still advocate for, like large tracts of wetlands. What's happening in the core of Houston, there's little small pockets of wetlands. But we know in order for habitats to really thrive, they need to be connected. And so that allows for more biodiversity. And so we actually mapped those 5 critical wetlands, these large tracts of wetlands. And then after mapping those with one of our earlier sort of scientists, Dr. John Jacob, after mapping them, we have launched advocacy and community advocacy to help folks that are in those wetlands advocate. And then concurrently, we have done the work not only in the 5 critical wetlands with community members, but we have in the last year launched work with communities downstream that are impacted by the loss of those wetlands by learning of the barriers or the interest of green stormwater infrastructure in those areas. So we just did that. Those were surveys and conversations, but basically community relationship building, advocacy in both these different areas is something I'm really proud of. The work around the downstream communities is emerging. So excited to see that. And the other thing that I'll share is our sewage work. We're known for that. And, a lot of people don't want to talk about sewage work, but this is so critical. This is a health issue. In Houston, through our legal work over the course of years, we've identified a lot of millions of gallons of untreated sewage going back into our waterways in Houston, and leverage the Clean Water Act to say that these are violations, and that and this all resulted in a consent decree, a 15-year consent decree to clean up our waterways. And not only did we do that, the other thing that I'm proud of is that we also are tracking that through our Justice in the Sewers map. And I think this is a good example of that intersectional sort of work that's needed, that layered approach. It's not enough to just have that data. The city of Houston is mandated to share their progress on the consent decree. This is how many sewage overflows are still going into the community. So we constantly monitor that data, but we won't stop at that. We also parrot that data with census tract data because we can see the zip code, and then when you see the race and ethnicity, that's when you learn that this is an environmental justice issue, that untreated sewage is going into Blacker and browner communities in certain zip codes that have already had compounded injustices that have happened. So this is even more of a disservice. So those are 2 very sort of different examples of, that show how we advocate around water quality, water quantity, through, flood mitigation and through nature-based solutions, water infrastructure, and then also sewage. So our work touches on a lot of different things, and it also shows how we integrate the different sort of fields, data science and litigation and community organizing.
Before Jose goes with his next question, I'm stunned by the depth and breadth of all of this stuff that you're involved in. I mean, it's like every one is a complex, challenging area, and you're involved in so many different things. Again, across that giant geography. So just comment and kudos there, and turn it back to Jose.
Yeah, thank you.
Well, my question is more about, as you look into the future, what gives you hope? What inspires you? Many cities in the Gulf and across the country really are having to grapple with more intense climate events, storms, more intense flooding. And so what are some of the things that inspire you in terms of rethinking water community resilience as well?
Jose, we've talked about narrative change so much. I think I'll name narrative change, narrative shift work, cultural strategies work. This is something that you probably don't expect me. You might expect me with my background to bring this up, but this is what gives me hope. We have to rethink how we do this work in this moment, and I think that gives me energy to think about, well, maybe the way that we've been doing this is not necessarily the way that we have to continue doing this work. And if we think about it from a cultural strategies perspective, there are so many cultures that have different relationships with water that we have not included in this work, or we don't think about that from a policy perspective or an organizing perspective. Number one, we have to restore our connection to water, because you can't advocate for what you don't know. And that's the main thing, is policymakers and decision makers, if they don't even know what a wetland is and what that looks like, the beauty that attracts, the different indicators that determine what a wetland is. If community does not know what that is, if my community does not know what their nearest bayou is, and they go to their bayou and see that, if we don't know where our water comes from, then this means nothing to us. And it's so easy to destroy that and to lose that, and we don't understand the impact of that loss. And so I think that restoring the connections to our waters and our watershed, and I think also from a policy perspective, I think there's a lot of problems of how we think about water policy. I'm really proud of the policy agenda that we have. It's an intersectional approach to policy that is driven by movement work. That is, it's really sort of unpacking how we think about policy. I think we have to go bold, but we have to make a lot of space for regeneration. And there's some communities who have experienced compounded injustices that are that will be impacted and are being impacted more in a different kind of a way. And so the impacts are not the same for all people. Considering that, where's a space for regeneration and for healing? Where's a space for culture? Because otherwise communities will, you think about the sort of mental health impacts, issues of depression. So how do we make space for regeneration? And that could be the connection, piece as well. I think the other piece is that we have to totally delve into policy too. But I think my approach in that, as a person that does not have a background into policy, that actually has a creative background, I always say that the very act of writing policy and creating policy is a creative act. And so we have to think about policy as creating, that historically that was imagined, like the thing that we use, the laws that we use, the things that protect our waterways and our habitats. And that was conceived amongst folks. And there was, dialogue and consensus and dissent. And then we arrived at this roadmap that guides how we can and cannot engage and protect our waterways and environment. But what if we involve communities in this, and we mobilize communities more, and we understand that we are envisioning a roadmap for future generations? And so as we are doing that, it doesn't feel as exhausting, even though we know this work is challenging, but we're collectively sort of participating in a creative act by writing policy. And it doesn't mean that everyone is technically writing policy, but the sort of consensus, the movement work, the education that happens in communities, so communities can be at the table with decision makers, the dialogues that we have with decision makers too. All of that is part of this larger co-creation and collective work to write, rewrite, and reimagine policy.
So much good perspective. I really enjoyed this conversation, building on getting to meet you recently. Good stuff going on down there. Thank you for sharing perspective and thoughts and knowledge with us.
Yeah, thank you, Travis. Thanks, Jose. Great to be in dialogue.
It's such a pleasure, Ayanna.
Thanks for listening. If you want to support Waterloop's ongoing exploration of water solutions, subscribe on YouTube, rate and review the podcast on Spotify and Apple, follow us on social media at The Waterloop, and sign up for email updates at waterloop.org. Until next time, be water, my friends.
You're in the Waterloop. You're in the Waterloop.